The concepts of the id, ego, and superego come from a theory of personality developed by Sigmund Freud, a famous psychologist. These three parts of the mind work together to influence how people think, feel, and act. The id represents basic desires and instincts, like hunger or the urge to have fun, and it operates on impulse without considering consequences. The ego is the realistic part that helps people make decisions by balancing the id's desires with what is practical. The superego represents moral values and rules, often guiding people to do what is right instead of what feels good or easy. Together, these three parts create a balance in how people behave. The ideas of the id, ego, and superego were introduced by Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century. Freud believed that the human mind has both conscious and unconscious parts, and he wanted to explain how these parts interact. He saw the id, ego, and superego as forces that shape personality and behaviour. Freud developed these ideas to understand inner conflicts and mental health problems, especially how people manage competing desires and rules. His work formed the foundation of psychoanalysis, a method for studying and treating the mind. Let's take a look at each concept in order, starting with the id. The id is the most basic and primal part of the mind. It represents instincts and drives such as hunger, thirst, and the desire for pleasure. Freud described the id as operating on the pleasure principle, meaning it seeks immediate satisfaction without thinking about consequences. For example, if a person is very hungry, their id might push them to grab food from someone else's plate without asking. Similarly, when a child cries because they want a toy right away, that is their id at work, the id doesn't consider whether actions are right or wrong, it only cares about fulfilling its needs. Now let's look at the ego. The ego is the part of the mind that balances the desires of the id with the demands of reality. It operates on the reality principle, meaning it tries to satisfy the id's needs in realistic and acceptable ways. For instance, if someone is hungry, their ego might encourage them to wait until lunchtime instead of grabbing someone else's food. Another example is when a student wants to skip homework and watch TV but chooses to finish their assignments first to avoid getting in trouble. The ego helps people make thoughtful decisions and solve problems by considering both their instincts and the rules of the world around them. Now let's look at the superego. The superego is the part of the mind that represents moral values, rules, and ideals. It develops as people grow and learn from parents, teachers, and society. The superego acts like an internal guide, encouraging people to do what is right and making them feel guilty when they do something wrong. For example, if someone finds a wallet on the ground, their superego might urge them to return it to its owner instead of keeping the money inside. Another example is when a person avoids lying because they believe it is morally wrong, even if lying could help them avoid punishment. The superego helps people live up to their moral standards and think about the impact of their actions on others. While Freud's ideas about the id, ego, and superego have been influential, they have also faced criticism. Some psychologists argue that these concepts are too abstract and lack scientific evidence. For example, it is difficult to measure or observe the id, ego, and superego directly, making them more of a theoretical idea than a proven fact. Others believe that Freud placed too much emphasis on instincts and inner conflicts while ignoring other factors like culture, relationships, and biology, which also shape personality. Additionally, critics say Freud's theories are outdated and do not fully apply to modern psychology. Despite these criticisms, the ideas of the id, ego, and superego remain important for understanding how people think about personality and behaviour.